Everyone expected her to fail. What she did with her violin shocked them all. Jasmine Carter always sat in the back corner of room 208. Right next to the window where the light hit just right, but no one ever looked. She never raised her hand. Never laughed too loud. Never made a scene. In a sea of noisy teens and rolling eyes, she was the silence they forgot existed. Teachers barely remembered her name. Students knew her only as that girl with the busted violin case. Like it was just a weird accessory, not the heartbeat she carried to and from school every day. Her instrument wasn't new or shiny, it was chipped at the edges. Strings slightly loose, the bow frayed like the shoelaces of a well-worn sneaker. But she held it like it was sacred, tucked close to her side, fingers gripping it like it was the last piece of herself she could still protect. Nobody asked why she brought it. Nobody cared enough to wonder. To them, she was a shadow, quiet, forgettable, black girl with a violin who probably didn't know how to use it. But Jasmine didn't need them to see her. Not yet, because while they dismissed her, she listened. While they laughed, she practiced. And while they scrolled and whispered and dared each other to mock her, she was building something real, note by note, breath by breath. The truth was, Jasmine wasn't invisible. They just hadn't bothered to look close enough. Not yet, but they would. It was third period when the announcement came over the intercom, cutting through the classroom hum like static. All students interested in performing at this year's Lincoln High Talent Showcase, please sign up outside the main office. Most kids barely looked up, already scrolling through their phones. But Mr. Grady, the PE coach who somehow always ended up organizing events he didn't care about, clapped his hands like it mattered. Come on, people, singers, dancers, magicians, dog jugglers, I don't care. Just sign up. Let's make this thing watchable. His voice carried that usual tone, part sarcasm, part obligation. Then came the spark. Ms. Carmichael, the math teacher with the perpetually sour coffee breath and that beige cardigan she wore like armor, leaned across her desk and locked eyes on the back row. How about Jasmine? She said, loud enough for the whole room. She's always carrying that violin like it's made of diamonds. Let's see what it can actually do. A few students snickered. Mr. Grady chuckled without missing a beat. Yeah, come on, Carter. Let's see some strings in action. Been lugging that thing around all year. Haven't even heard a squeak. The laughter started small, just a few throats, but it rolled through the classroom like a wave, rising in rhythm with the embarrassment they hoped she'd feel. Someone near the front whispered something about cat noises. Another kid mimicked a screechy violin sound with exaggerated gestures, arms flailing like a cartoon. Ms. Carmichael folded her arms and added, just teasing, sweetheart, with a smile that pretended it hadn't stung. Jasmine didn't look up. Not at first. Her hands tightened around the neck of her violin case, knuckles pale, but her face stayed unreadable. The jokes weren't new, neither was the mockery. What was new was the challenge buried inside them, a dare wrapped in laughter, served like candy but laced with something sour. When she finally lifted her eyes, she didn't look at anyone in particular, just straight ahead. Voice quiet but clear. I'll do it. No pause, no drama. Like she'd just ordered lunch. The room went silent, not because they were impressed, but because they didn't expect it. Mr. Grady blinked. Ms. Carmichael raised her eyebrows. Well, all right then, she said with a smirk, though her eyes betrayed her. That wasn't the answer she thought she'd get. She expected Jasmine to shrink, to laugh it off, to say nothing. Not this. Jasmine reached forward and grabbed the clipboard being passed around, writing her name without fanfare. Jasmine Carter, all caps, no hesitation. And that's when the shift happened, not loud or obvious, but quiet like a hinge turning on an old door. The rest of the period moved on. Bell rang. Chairs scraped back, but something was different in the air. Jasmine had said yes. That wasn't supposed to happen. In their minds, she was background noise, not a headline. She was supposed to stay quiet, stay invisible, keep carrying that violin like it was just for show. But now she was in it. And they weren't ready. The jokes kept coming in whispers. The bets started forming during lunch. And half the school waited for her to fail. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't answer. She didn't even look at them. She just walked through the hallways like she had something bigger waiting. Like every step was one beat closer to a truth only she could play. They thought they were setting her up for a joke. What they didn't realize was, she was already writing the punchline. Home wasn't much. Apartment 4B sat above a laundromat on the corner of Jackson and 12th. The kind of place where the hallway always smelled like old detergent and the lights flickered when it rained too hard. But for Jasmine Carter, it was everything. It was where her world began and ended every single day. After school, while other kids dropped their bags and turned on video games, Jasmine walked straight into her shared bedroom, closed the door behind her, and placed her violin case on the bed like it was made of glass. She didn't stop for snacks, didn't scroll through her phone, didn't even take off her shoes right away. The second the latch on the case clicked open, everything else faded. It wasn't a fancy violin. Not even close. The wood was chipped from years of use. The E-string buzzed if she pressed too hard, and the bow frayed at the edges like a worn-out ribbon. The bridge leaned slightly left, and the pegs needed tightening every hour. But when she played it, it spoke, and not in the polished way orchestra violins did. It cried, it trembled, it roared, it whispered, it told stories she didn't know how to say out loud. Her fingers moved instinctively, not from reading sheet music, she didn't have much of that, but from muscle memory built over years of quiet practice. She played barefoot, toes curled into the worn carpet as if grounding herself to the sound. No one ever taught her how to perform. Her lessons didn't come from classrooms or polished studios. They came from her grandfather, who used to sit on the porch with a battered fiddle, telling her, "Let the music say what your mouth can't." He passed when she was 9, but his words stayed with her, etched into every note she played. Her mother, Denise Carter, worked long shifts at the hospital downtown, cleaning surgical floors. She left the apartment around 6 in the evening and didn't come home until close to sunrise. Still, she always paused at the door before she left. "You practicing, Jas?" she'd ask, keys jingling in one hand. Exhaustion wrapped around her voice like a scarf. "Yeah," Jasmine would say, already tuning her strings. "Good. Play it like someone's listening. Even if they're not." And someone always was. Denise would lean against the thin wall of their apartment, eyes closed, letting her daughter's music fill the silence she spent all day walking through. That was the rule. No headphones, no speakers, just raw sound. When Jasmine was off pitch, her mom would tap the wall 3 times. Not angry, not disappointed, just honest. "Start again." She'd call softly, "You got more in you." Jasmine would nod, even if no one could see it, and begin from the top. Again, and again, and again. Most nights, she played until her fingertips throbbed and her wrist ached. And even then, she wouldn't stop until the piece felt right, not perfect, just true. The music wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't for applause or attention. It was survival. It was how she processed the things she didn't talk about, the jokes at school, the way people looked past her like she didn't exist, the pressure of always having to be better just to be seen. Her violin was her voice in a world that rarely let her speak. Sometimes she wrote her own pieces. Not on paper, just in her head. They didn't have names. They didn't need them. One was slow, starting soft like the hush before a storm. Another started sharp, notes bending like screams, then settled into something almost like hope. She didn't always know what she was playing until it was already out of her. Like the violin knew her better than she knew herself. Her little brother Jordan, 6 and full of questions, would sometimes sit in the doorway, legs crossed, watching in silence. "Why don't you play happy songs?" he asked one night, his voice barely louder than the hum of their old fridge. Jasmine paused, bow hovering mid-air. "I do," she said. "They just sound different sometimes." He frowned. "They sound like crying." She smiled, just barely. Sometimes happy and sad are the same thing. He didn't get it, not really, but he nodded anyway. That night, she played until the world outside her window disappeared, until the sound drowned out the creak of the radiator, the buzz of neon from the laundromat sign, the sirens that always seemed to wail in the distance. She didn't need an audience. She didn't need applause. All she needed was that space, that time, and that instrument, in that room, with her violin in hand. Jasmine Carter wasn't invisible. She wasn't small. She wasn't the girl with the frayed bow and quiet voice. She was something more, something powerful, a storm wrapped in strings and silence. Finally learning how to roar. The gym at Roosevelt Middle smelled like floor polish and anticipation. It was Friday, the day of the talent showcase, and the whole school buzzed with equal parts excitement and hunger for spectacle. Fold-out chairs scraped against scuffed tiles as kids filed in, phones already recording before anything began. Teachers leaned against the walls, sipping lukewarm coffee, waiting for something, anything, to break the routine. No one said it out loud, but they all had one name in mind. Jasmine Carter. She was number 17 on the list, tucked between a knock-knock joke act and a kid doing TikTok dances. Whispers about her had been circulating all week, bets made in whispers by lockers. Jokes flung around like dodgeballs. She's gonna freeze. She won't even show up. What if she plays, Mary had a little lamb, and cries? The laughter always followed, always, and Jasmine heard it all. Every word, every eye roll, every doubt, but she didn't flinch. She didn't defend herself or ask anyone to believe in her. She just kept showing up, silent, steady, violin case in hand. Backstage, she sat alone on a metal folding chair, her bow resting across her knees like a drawn breath waiting to be released. She'd barely eaten that morning, just a piece of dry toast and some water. Her hands ached from overpractice, but she flexed them gently, one finger at a time, stretching out the stiffness like a ritual. She wasn't nervous, not exactly. What she felt was heat, like something rising inside her, something she had no words for, something that only came out through sound. A student volunteer with a headset peeked through the curtain and mumbled, "You're next." Jasmine stood, slow but certain, and walked to the side of the stage. From the crowd came murmurs, laughs trying to mask discomfort. "Is she really gonna play?" Someone whispered. "Watch her mess up the first note." Jasmine heard none of it. Or maybe she did, but by now, it didn't matter. The MC's voice cracked through the mic. Hesitant. "Next up, Jasmine Carter." A weak ripple of applause trickled through the gym, more polite than sincere. Some kids barely looked up. Others raised their phones, thumbs hovering, ready to record whatever disaster they assumed was coming. Jasmine stepped out under the harsh overhead light, her violin cradled in her left hand, her bow in her right. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she didn't say a word. She just moved to the center, planted her feet, and lifted the instrument to her shoulder. Then, silence. The kind of silence that hums in your ears. For a second, even the MC looked confused. Miss Carmichael, watching from the front row, leaned forward like she was waiting for the punchline. And just when someone in the back snorted a laugh, Jasmine played. The first note came out thin, soft as breath. It floated through the air like it wasn't sure it belonged. But she held it, pulled it, stretched it into something bigger. By the fifth note, the gym had gone still. No coughs, no giggles, just listening. Her bow danced across the strings with purpose, telling a story no one expected. It wasn't a song they knew, wasn't classical, wasn't pop, wasn't something from a movie soundtrack. It was something else, raw, original, pain wrapped in melody, resilience stitched into rhythm. The music rose and fell like a tide, then surged into something fierce. Jasmine bent the notes, stretched them, twisted them into cries and gasps and whispered truths. Her fingers moved fast, like they were chasing something only she could see. Her eyes were closed, but she didn't need them. Everything she felt poured through the strings. It was like watching someone speak a language no one had taught her. But somehow everyone understood. At the climax, she hit a high note and held it so long the air felt heavy. Like the room itself was holding its breath. Then she let it unravel, one trembling thread at a time, into silence. When the last note faded, she didn't move, didn't bow, just stood there, violin against her chest like a heartbeat, breathing steady. For a second, no one knew what to do. Then, one clap, from the back, then another, until the whole gym erupted. Not with wild cheers, but with something slower, deeper, respect. Some kids put their phones down, ashamed they'd filmed her, hoping for failure. Malik, the only student who ever really talked to her, stood up first. Then others followed, even the ones who doubted her, laughed at her, looked through her. They stood too. Not because they had to. Because they couldn't not. Jasmine didn't smile, didn't cry. She just turned and walked off stage. Violin still in hand, head held quiet and high. Mr. Grady gave her a nod. Awkward and unsure. Ms. Carmichael didn't say anything, just sat still, chewing her silence like it tasted bitter. But none of it mattered. Because in that moment, Jasmine Carter wasn't a joke. She wasn't the quiet girl with the beat-up case. She was a voice they couldn't ignore. A storm they never saw coming. For a moment, after the last note dissolved into the gym's rafters, there was nothing. No laughter, no whispers, not even the usual scuff of sneakers on the floor. Just silence, dense, heavy, meaningful. Jasmine Carter stood center stage, violin resting against her chest like something alive. Her bow lowered, eyes still closed. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't cried. She didn't need to. Everything she could have said was already out there, hanging in the air, still echoing in people's bones. And then came the first clap. It was small, soft. From the back, someone too moved to hold it in. Another followed. Then another. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't loud. It was slow, like people had to shift something inside themselves before their hands could move. But it grew, a ripple, a wave, until the entire gym was clapping, not out of obligation or politeness, but from a place they didn't know music could touch. Some kids looked down at their phones in shame, remembering they'd pressed record to catch a failure, not a triumph. Others just watched her, stunned, eyes wide, mouths closed, like they were seeing someone they'd never really looked at before. Malik was the first to rise. He stood near the middle row, his hands moving before anyone else's. He didn't yell, didn't cheer. He just stood tall, eyes locked on Jasmine, clapping slow and steady like he'd known it all along. Then more students stood, not just her friends. She didn't have many, but the same kids who'd rolled their eyes when she passed in the halls. The same ones who snickered when she tuned her violin by the lockers. They rose too. Some looked uncomfortable, unsure of why they were standing. But they did it anyway. Ms. Carmichael didn't move. She sat frozen, her usual smirk gone, replaced with something unreadable. Maybe confusion, maybe regret. Mr. Grady tried to act casual, nodding like he'd always believed in her, but he didn't say a word. Jasmine didn't wait for them. She walked off stage the same way she walked on, silent, steady, calm. But something was different now. She wasn't hiding behind her silence anymore. She had turned it into something that spoke louder than any voice in that building. The applause followed her backstage, and even as it faded, the weight of it stayed. She didn't need anyone to come tell her she was good. She didn't need to hear their apologies or their excuses. The room had already said it for them. Every pair of eyes that had avoided her now couldn't look away. Every person who laughed was now standing. Not because she demanded it, but because the truth demanded it. That was the power of her music. It didn't beg. It didn't explain. It just existed, whole and undeniable. And for the first time, they saw her not as the quiet girl with the broken violin, but as someone who mattered. Someone who made them feel. Jasmine didn't have to say a word. She had already said everything. Monday came wrapped in gray skies and the scent of rain-soaked pavement. The kind of morning that usually made students drag their feet and teachers clutch coffee cups like lifelines. But this Monday felt different. Something had shifted, quiet but real, and Jasmine Carter could feel it the moment she stepped through the front doors of Roosevelt Middle. The halls that once swallowed her whole now seemed to part just slightly as she walked. Eyes followed her, not with mockery or dismissal like before, but with curiosity. Maybe even a little awe. A group of 8th graders near the vending machine paused mid-conversation as she passed. One of them whispered, "That's her," and though she didn't look back, Jasmine heard it, not in the way she used to hear their jokes or side comments, but in a way that made her shoulders feel a little lighter. Her name wasn't a punchline anymore. It had become something else. Recognition, not the kind that screams or demands attention, but the kind that lingers. That Monday, no one tried to trip her in the hallway. No one called her the violin girl, like it was some weird insult. A few nodded, some just stepped out of her way. But what mattered wasn't what they did, it was what they didn't. No one laughed, no one looked through her like she didn't exist. And that was new. She passed Mr. Grady near the stairwell. He had his phone in one hand and a stack of gym passes in the other. "Hey, Carter," he said, voice awkward and smile forced. "Amazing job Friday." Jasmine gave him a small nod. No more, no less. She didn't owe him anything. He'd only clapped when everyone else did. Farther down the hall, standing by her classroom door with a stack of freshly printed math worksheets, was Ms. Carmichael, the same teacher who'd turned Jasmine's name into a joke just days earlier. The same one who had smirked, nudged, and made sure everyone laughed loud enough for her to hear. But now she wasn't smirking. She wasn't saying anything at all, just watching Jasmine with a look that tried to be composed, but couldn't hide the tightness in her jaw. "Miss Carter," she said finally, cautious. "Could I have a word?" Jasmine stopped, but didn't move closer. She waited. Ms. Carmichael cleared her throat, the worksheets in her hand trembling just slightly. "I owe you an apology. What I said last week, it wasn't right." A long pause filled the space between them. Jasmine didn't rush to fill it. "I shouldn't have made assumptions," the teacher added, her voice softer now. "I'm still learning." Jasmine looked at her, not with anger, not even with frustration, but with something deeper, something calm, something honest. She didn't raise her voice or deliver a dramatic speech. She just said, "You should have seen me before Friday." Ms. Carmichael blinked, caught off guard by how much weight those words carried. No insult, no bitterness, just truth. Jasmine turned and walked away, leaving the teacher to chew on silence, the same silence she'd once mistaken for weakness. That day, even the cafeteria felt different. Jasmine slid into her usual seat near the end of the table. And for the first time, no one moved away. Malik sat beside her without asking, casually pushing a carton of chocolate milk in her direction. "Next time," he said with a grin. "We do a duet." Jasmine rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the smirk tugging at her mouth. "You're not ready," she said. A few heads turned. Some kids blinked, surprised to hear her voice. A couple even smiled. It wasn't loud, but it was real. That was the thing about change. It doesn't crash through the doors all at once. It sneaks in through the cracks. Through sideways glances, quiet nods, shared silence. Not everyone clapped on Friday because they cared. Not everyone who stood that day meant it with their whole heart. But some did, and sometimes, that's enough. Because once the music is played, once the silence is broken, once someone makes you feel something you can't quite name, you can't go back to pretending they're invisible. Not fully. Jasmine didn't play her violin that night. She sat on the living room floor with Jordan, watching cartoons with the sound off. Her mom peeked in from the kitchen. "Not practicing?" she asked. "Not tonight," Jasmine said. "You good?" Jasmine thought for a second, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm good." She didn't need applause. She didn't need everyone to suddenly love her. She just needed them to see her. And finally, they did. Not everyone changed. Not everyone clapped because they were moved. Some did it because it felt easier than staying seated. Some still looked at Jasmine Carter and only saw what they wanted to see. But for a few, for the ones who truly listened, who felt that shift in the air when her bow met the strings, it was enough. Enough to see her, enough to start thinking differently. And that's how change begins. Quietly, not in thunder or applause, but in the way someone walks away from a performance and can't stop thinking about it. If you've ever been doubted, if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or laughed at, remember Jasmine. Remember the girl they tried to turn into a joke, who didn't fight back with words, but with truth wrapped in music. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to speak in your own voice. And sometimes, that voice looks like a song, a story, a sketch, a movement. However it comes out, let it. Your silence might protect you, but your truth will set you free. So whatever it is you carry, your passion, your pain, your brilliance, don't hide it. Play it, show it, live it. Thank you so much for watching this story. If it made you feel something, anything, take a moment to share it. Leave a comment, and let others know they're not alone. And if you want more stories like this, stories that lift the quiet voices and turn them into something unforgettable, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We've got more coming, and you don't want to miss what's next. Until then, keep showing up, keep speaking out, and above all, never stop playing your truth.